This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Karina Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different Q's.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Now joining us in studio is United States Senator Susan Collins. Welcome to the show. We're so excited to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I've listened to your podcast and have always found it to be so informative. So I am just delighted to join you today.
Well, we certainly appreciate that.
What is your perspective on the capture of Venezuelan President Maduro in terms of United States drug trafficking policy and regional stability?
I've been briefed by the Secretary of State on this operation, which was a law enforcement effort. FBI agents actually did the arrest. They were protected by our troops because obviously it's a very dangerous situation. There's no doubt that Maduro was an illegally chosen president of Venezuela. He fixed the election. He ignored the results. And he is a narco-terrorist. He was indicted in the Southern District of New York 5 years ago on serious drug charges. I was surprised at the operation. I was briefed after it, but the security on it had to be extremely tight. So he will be tried in the United States, and there are very serious allegations against him. In addition, he has made the lives of Venezuelans miserable. There is a new United Nations report that talks in depth about the killings, the torture, the sexual abuse that his henchmen have done in order to keep him in power. And as I said, he's in power as a result of an illegal election, which he actually lost, but he would not give up power. Now, I do want to know more details, and I expect once we're back in session that the Intelligence Committee on which I serve will get an in-depth classified briefing. I am a little unclear what the president means when he says that the United States is going to run Venezuela. That doesn't strike me as a very plausible approach, but I don't know any of the details about that yet.
What role should Congress play in oversight and accountability while still allowing the executive branch to act quickly on national security threats?
There's always been tension between the executive branch and the legislative branch when it comes to war powers. Congress, under the War Powers Act, has the authority to declare war under the Constitution, but also to authorize the use of military force. The president, on the other hand, is commander-in-chief and has the authority under the Constitution to protect us and to respond to any kind of imminent threat. There's a constant tension there on whose role is more dominant. And frankly, it depends on the circumstances of the case. In this case, we need more details to find out. And I think there will be another attempt to either authorize the action or to block further action in Venezuela. I would point out there's also a big difference between a land attack versus taking out drug boats on international waters when the boats are not flagged as belonging to any particular country. And I can tell you that there's a lot of intelligence work that goes into identifying those drug boats. We do have a horrible crisis in this country with drugs killing more people in the last 2 years than all of the Americans who were killed in the Vietnam War. Just think about that. we do have a very serious problem, and there's no doubt that while a lot of fentanyl precursors originate in China and then go through Mexico, that Venezuela is a major source of cocaine for this country, and cocaine kills.
Well, staying with national security for a moment, you've helped bring substantial defense funding to Maine through your appropriations role. How critical is Bath Iron Works to maintaining Navy readiness right now?
Bath Iron Works is absolutely critical to our nation's security and to our fleet for the Navy. We're seeing China increase the number of ships that it is building. They are not as capable as our ships, but quantity matters. And that's why we are so fortunate to have the world's best shipyard in the state of Maine. Bath Iron Works is one of only 2 surface combatant shipyards in the United States. It builds destroyers that are the workhorse of our fleet, and only the Huntington Ingalls shipyard in Mississippi also has that capability. So I'm very proud of the work that Bath Iron Works does. I work hard to try to make sure that our Navy shipbuilding budget is adequate. It was underfunded in the previous administration, and that's one reason China's been able to leap ahead of us in the sheer number of ships. That is very dangerous. We've seen in the Middle East how important our destroyers are as they have shot down missiles from Iran and from the Houthis. And I've been very proud that our Bath-built destroyers have an extraordinary record of success in bringing down those missiles that have been aimed in some cases at commercial shipping, at Israel, and also at our own troops. So having destroyers accompany aircraft carriers is absolutely critical to our national security. I have been working with Bath Iron Works for years to increase the number of ships that it is able to turn out, and they're getting back on track after some difficult time during COVID. And it's great to see them cranking out the most advanced destroyers. I work very hard to make sure that Bath is able to get the workforce that it needs. For example, I secured federal funding for welder programs at Southern Maine Community College and York County Community College. And those welders are snapped up by Bath Iron Works, by the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, and by the Pratt & Whitney aircraft plant, the engine plant, which is in North Berwick. So I love being able to secure that funding, whether it's for workforce training or whether it's for affordable housing or parking on the lots or to improve the equipment of Bath Iron Works and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is absolutely critical. And right here in Bangor, we can be very proud of the fact that the Job Corps is training people to go work at Bath Iron Works, teaching them to do very intricate ship pipe building. It's a lot of technical work. And believe me, when they come out of the Job Corps Center, which I'm a huge supporter of and help to save from closure, those Job Corps participants are snapped up by industry, or they go on to higher education or enter the workforce right here in this area. So it's something where I've been able to use my position on the Appropriations Committee to make a real difference in national defense, in public safety. Right now, I'm up to more than 30 fire stations that I've been able to secure funding for all over the state, ranging from St. Agat in the north to Limerick and York County and virtually everywhere in between. And that is a great source of satisfaction as well.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, co-hosting with my husband, David Quirk, and we are having a conversation with United States Senator Susan Collins.
You announced recently $190 million for the first year funding for rural health transformation programs. What can you tell us about that?
I feel so strongly about rural health care. It allows people to live where they want to live in our state. And local hospitals not only provide essential health care, but they're often one of the biggest employers in a small town as well. I grew up in Caribou, and my uncle was a physician there. My father was head of the hospital board. I've had a brother and a niece on the hospital board, and it's always been near and dear to my heart. So I have been very worried about the fate of our rural hospitals. We saw one in Waterville, a more urban area, close recently. There are 4 others that are in more rural parts of our state that are really teetering on the brink of insolvency. They need more help. Part of the problem is that the Medicaid program, which is state and federal, does not fully reimburse for the cost of care. In a state like ours, which is disproportionately older and lower income, Medicare and Medicaid are the number 1 and number 2 payers at most hospitals. They pay less for reimbursing for care than private insurers. So we're in a vulnerable position. When the administration was proposing cutbacks in the Medicaid program, I was very concerned about how our rural hospitals would survive. I propose that we do a $50 billion fund to help our rural hospitals and also to explore new ways of delivering care that might be less expensive. I'll give you a very quick example. I've talked to and support a lot of ambulance services. Many times when they're called out on a call, they really don't need to transfer the person to a hospital, but they do need to provide the person with care. But they need to be reimbursed for that care. It's called treating in place. So I have a bill with Peter Welch of Vermont, who has very similar challenges, so that they would be reimbursed. That's the kind of transformational care that we can talk about. Doing more telemedicine is another. That's so important to our islands. And I've worked with Eastern Maine Community College in doing more training of EMS personnel using Zoom and equipment I was able to secure for them, and new ambulances so that they could train people. And it was wonderful recently to be at Eastern Maine Community College and participate in one of their classes. And they had people from Swans Island who had enrolled in the program. That is absolutely critical to a place like Swans Island. So this new $50 billion program, Maine did very well under. We're in the top 10 on a per capita basis for getting funding, and it was approximately $190 million. And that will help support workforce initiatives, which are really important to our rural hospitals to have enough healthcare providers, and also to explore more innovative ways of providing care. For example, I recently spoke in Boston at a global healthcare conference, and they were showing me how they could use scanning equipment and transmit it so that a healthcare provider who had the expertise in Boston, for example, could guide a healthcare provider who wasn't an expert in a small rural hospital in Maine. And that's so exciting because then they can give them guidance on whether the patient needs to be transported or can stay there and get the care that is appropriate. that's the kind of transformational care that we're looking for. But it is essential that we have those rural hospitals because I'm concerned about so many of them not being able to provide obstetrics care anymore. That means if you're a young couple who wants to have a family, you're not going to want to drive 2 hours to get prenatal care and to do the delivery. So we're working hard to try to solve those kinds of problems, and that's exactly what this funding is intended for. I fought very hard for it. I told the administration that I felt that it was absolutely essential and that we need to build up that rural healthcare network. I also want to point out that this is just the first tranche of the funding. It's going to be over 5 years. Now it's going to become more and more competitive. Every state received something this time. I weighed in with Dr. Oz, who is the head of the Medicare agency called CMS, and he knows how important it is, the state of Maine. He actually has a summer home in the state of Maine and is more familiar with our hospitals because of that, which is very helpful. But there will be 5 more tranches of funding from this fund. This is the first of the $10 billion, but we will do 4 more. This is a long-term investment in rural health care.
Well, it's needed.
So I also know that you're working with Senator Bernie Moreno from Ohio, working on getting the ACA funding for that.
Yes. First of all, let me say how much I enjoy working with Senator Moreno. He is terrific. And senators can be very hard to organize, and he is very good at organizing them. So what most people don't realize, we brought together a group of about 16 senators, Democrats and Republicans, prior to the Christmas break. And we met for nearly 2 hours to try to come up with a plan that would prevent the enhanced premium tax credits that are under the Affordable Care Act and were expanded during COVID from expiring or going back to the far lower amounts at the end of this year. They have now expired. The problem is that cost of health insurance has gone through the roof. And the result could well be a lot of people who don't get health insurance through the workplace because they're self-insured, they work for themselves, or their employer is very small and doesn't provide health insurance. It's to prevent them from losing their health insurance altogether. And they need this tax subsidy in order to afford it. The problem is that during the Biden administration, there was no household income cap put on the subsidy. And that's not fair to working people to ask them to subsidize the health care of people who are making hundreds of thousands of dollars. So we want to put a cap, a reasonable household cap. And we also want, in order to help prevent fraud, which has been a problem, to have everyone pay something. We're talking about $5 per month towards the cost of their health insurance. That would prevent, I don't think this happens in Maine much at all, but in some states, there have been some unscrupulous health insurance brokers who have enrolled people without their even knowing that they're enrolled. They get the commission, and the person doesn't even know they have the insurance. It's out now fraud. So that's something, if you know every month that you're paying $5 towards the cost of your insurance, this would be for lower income people, it would go up as income goes up, then you're going to know that you're enrolled in insurance, and it will crack down and indeed prevent the fraud that is occurring. We brought together a group of people, and what people don't know is we've continued to meet via Zoom over the recess. So we met right before Christmas, we've met after Christmas to further refine what we're doing. And what we want to do is in the first year, just do reforms that we know can be implemented. The household income cap, which will still be generous. It'll probably be $200,000, but it's not going to be no cap at all. And then the $5 a month skin in the game anti-fraud provision. In the second year, we want to address the high cost of premiums, which is the underlying problem here. And there are ways that you can restructure the Affordable Care Act to have what are called cost-sharing reductions that bring down the cost of premiums by 11% overall, which would be extremely helpful. And we also would establish health savings accounts, and that would help people with their out-of-pocket expenses, which can be pretty high with some of these high-deductible healthcare plans. So those are two bigger reforms that we can't get in place quickly, but we could get in place next year. So we're talking about a 2-year plan. There are other reforms that would help lower the cost of healthcare. For example, there are pharmacy benefit managers who are reimbursed when they negotiate pharmaceutical costs and choose drugs to go on formularies for health insurance plans. The problem is the incentives are all backwards. They make more money if they choose the more expensive drugs. So we need to do more reforms in that area and have more price transparency also in healthcare in general. Those are longer-term reforms, but we simply cannot allow some 22 million Americans who are receiving health insurance through the Affordable Care Act marketplace to be in jeopardy of losing their health insurance because of the high cost and the expiration of the enhanced premium tax credit. Let me also make clear that our healthcare system needs fundamental reforms. A lot of people who do get insurance through their workplace have huge deductibles and are paying heavy premiums every month. So there's a lot of reform that needs to be done. And I think price transparency is part of that. So if you know that a colonoscopy costs X in one hospital and costs less in another, you should be able to find that out very easily and make your own choices. I was also very concerned when Northern Light and Blue Cross Blue Shield were at odds because that's an incredibly important insurer in our state and an incredibly important hospital network in our state. I'm glad they finally at the last minute appeared to have reached a solution, but imagine if all of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Anthem customers could no longer go to any of Northern Lights hospitals. That would have been a disaster.
Yeah, especially in Bangor, they have the only cardiac unit around. So if you had a heart attack, obviously St. Joseph's can't do a bypass.
Exactly. So I think that we need to take a look at our whole healthcare system because the insurance rates are out of control. Now, I will say that there are things that can be done at the state level. And one is to have what are called high-risk pools. And I spent 5 years in state government heading the department that included the Bureau of Insurance. And high-risk pools can spread the risk and thus lower premiums. And we were using them effectively in Maine for a while. And then the individual and group market got combined, and a lot of other changes were made that caused rates to go up. So there is more that we can do. I also want to make clear that on Medicaid, I mentioned that the reimbursements are not high enough, and that's a problem for our hospitals. I also believe that there are people who are on Medicaid that have the ability to work and should not qualify for Medicaid. Now, I'm talking about able-bodied adults without young children and without caregiving responsibilities, say taking care of a parent with Alzheimer's disease, for example. There are good reasons why that person might not be able to work. But in general, I believe that work imparts dignity, self-confidence, and skills that our country needs and that are very good for the person and his or her family. So not everybody should qualify for Medicaid. It should be those who can't work or are seniors, and sometimes they are eligible for both Medicare and Medicaid if they're low-income seniors, or children with disabilities, for example, low-income families. But if you're an able-bodied adult without children depending on you, without a senior you're taking care of, there are a lot of jobs out there.
What about universal health care or government health care or government-run hospitals? What's your opinion on that?
I'm skeptical of having the government take over health care. I look at the waiting lists, for example, in Canada to get procedures and how Canadians will come into Maine because they have to wait so long. And that is a direct result of having a government-run healthcare program.
Well, speaking of Medicare, my mother, she still works full-time. Her full-time is 55 hours a week, but her prescription cost is $500 a month, and that's to survive. So is there any more work being done on lowering the cost of prescription drugs?
There is indeed, and there are two avenues that are being pursued. First of all, the Trump administration is negotiating with pharmaceutical companies to get lower healthcare costs. And to me, that makes all the sense in the world. The federal government is a major payer through the Medicare and Medicaid program and the CHIP program for children. So just as a private insurer negotiates for those costs, I think it makes sense for the federal government, for the federal programs to be negotiating for those costs. And there have been some successes already. In addition, one area that I've worked particularly hard on is the price of insulin. It makes no sense to me that insulin, which was discovered more than 100 years ago in Canada, and the patent rights were given away in order to make it readily available, costs as much as it does. Now, I realize there are different kinds of insulin, and it's a lot more sophisticated than the insulin of 100 years ago, but it still should not be as costly as it is. And I held a hearing when I was chair of the aging committee to look at why is the cost of insulin so high. This is particularly a problem for people with type 1 diabetes, which used to be called juvenile diabetes, but it's a problem for people with type 2, older people who depend on insulin as well. To me, this is where I became aware of the role played by the pharmacy benefit manager, because there came onto the market what is called a biosimilar for insulin. That's what we would call a generic when we're talking about other kinds of drugs. And it rolled out at a much lower cost than the identical insulin that was an alternative to. The pharmacy benefit managers would not choose the biosimilar version of insulin to be one of the choices under the insurance plans because they didn't make enough money from it. That's wrong. And I've introduced a reform bill with Jeanne Shaheen, Democratic senator from New Hampshire. Both of us are very committed to reforming the whole process for insulin and also for the disincentives that cause the less expensive identical drug not to be available to the consumer. I also think that the cost savings that are negotiated should be passed on to the consumer. And right now, that often does not happen. It supposedly is used to lower premiums, but to me, it should go right to the consumer.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 with United States Senator Susan Collins. Make sure to tune in to part 2 tomorrow, Sunday, January 11th at 6:30 a.m. on VOM, The Voice of Maine. It is a must listen. You don't want to miss it.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.